Hey everyone, welcome back to Quiet Mind. I'm glad you're here. Maybe you've had a long day, or maybe your thoughts have been heavy, circling, refusing to slow down. And perhaps you didn't even plan on listening to something like this tonight. But somehow, you found your way here. That's no accident. Before we jump in, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment down below telling me what time of day you're watching this and where you're tuning in from. It's always so cool seeing our community from all over the world. Tonight's journey is about something that everyone, at some point, feels but often misunderstands. Being alone. We live in a world where solitude is often confused with loneliness, where the quiet moments are treated as problems to be solved, rather than experiences to be explored. But what if you've been told the wrong story about being alone? What if solitude carries within it a power, a clarity, even a beauty that you've been taught to ignore? So, as we begin, let me simply say, you are exactly where you need to be. There is nothing to do right now except listen. And if your mind drifts, that's fine. If you fall asleep, that's fine too. The words will keep flowing, carrying you deeper. Now, if you'd like, you can let your eyes close. Or not, you decide. Just let my voice take the weight off your thoughts, piece by piece, as we step together into this exploration of what it really means to be alone. Before we can move anywhere else, we need to look carefully at a confusion that has haunted language itself, the difference between being alone and being lonely. These two words are often treated as if they are identical, but they are not. Being alone simply describes a condition, one body, one mind, existing without immediate company. It says nothing about pain, nothing about joy. It is neutral, like describing the weather. You might be alone in a room, alone in a forest, alone on a train. It is a fact, not a judgment. Loneliness, on the other hand, is not a fact. It is a feeling. It is the aching awareness of absence, the heavy sense that something vital is missing. Loneliness is not about how many people are around you. It is about the meaning you assign to that situation. You can feel lonely in the middle of a crowded party. You can feel perfectly at peace while sitting alone on a mountaintop. Psychology has studied this distinction for decades. Researchers note that loneliness activates parts of the brain linked to pain. When someone experiences deep social isolation, the body reacts almost as if it has been injured. Stress hormones rise, immune systems weaken, and the mind begins to spiral. Loneliness is not a small thing. It is a biological warning sign. But being alone does not always trigger that pain. Sometimes being alone can be the opposite of lonely. In solitude, there is space to think, to breathe, to hear one's own voice without interruption. Solitude can even restore. Some psychologists argue that the ability to be comfortable in solitude is a marker of emotional maturity because it shows that you are not entirely dependent on others to regulate your feelings. And yet, because language often blends the two terms together, many people grow up fearing both. They hear the phrase, "don't be alone," and interpret it as, "don't be lonely." They see a friend sitting by themselves and assume sadness, when perhaps that friend is deeply content. Here is the paradox. In a world more connected than ever, true solitude is rare. We fill silence with screens, notifications, constant voices that travel through our devices. And so, being alone begins to look frightening, unnatural, even though it is one of the most natural states a human being can experience. Let's go deeper. Why does solitude sometimes feel peaceful and sometimes unbearable? The answer lies in the stories we tell ourselves when we are alone. If you sit in a quiet room and think, "no one cares about me," then loneliness sharpens its claws. But if you sit in the same room and think, "this is my time to recharge," solitude opens like a door into freedom. This first distinction, alone versus lonely, seems simple, but it is the foundation. Without it, we can't move forward. Because if we treat solitude only as danger, we blind ourselves to its hidden gift. And if we treat loneliness only as weakness, we miss its warning signal. So as we continue, remember, being alone is not what you think. Sometimes it is pain, sometimes it is peace. And in that duality, in that tension, lies the mystery we are going to unravel together tonight. The double-edged sword of loneliness. As we move deeper, let's pause and really consider this word we so casually throw around, lonely. It's a word that can sound heavy, almost sharp, like a blade cutting into silence. Yet for some, That same word carries a softness, a sense of refuge. How can one experience hold both pain and peace? That's what makes loneliness such a fascinating and misunderstood state of being. Most of us have been taught to see loneliness only as a negative, something to escape, something that signals failure, something that whispers, "You are unwanted." But the truth is more complex. Psychology shows us that loneliness is not a single thing. It isn't just about being physically without others. It's about the gap between the connection you desire and the connection you actually feel. That means you can be lonely in a crowded room, surrounded by friends, scrolling through endless messages online, and still feel that sting. And yet, in the same breath, loneliness can also open doors. When you are alone, without the noise of other voices shaping your thoughts, you can finally hear yourself. There's a clarity in the stillness, a strange mirror where you notice what you've been ignoring. Sometimes that mirror is uncomfortable. It shows you fears you've buried or truths you've denied. But sometimes it reflects back strengths you didn't know you carried, desires you didn't realize were yours. Think about how often we run from that mirror. The second the silence creeps in, we grab the phone, we turn on the TV, we call someone just to fill the air. We treat loneliness like an enemy instead of a teacher. But what if for just a moment, you let yourself lean into it? What would you find if you didn't run away? There's also something evolutionary here. Loneliness is wired into us. Long ago, to be separated from the group was dangerous. It meant vulnerability, exposure, a higher risk of death. That's why even today, loneliness triggers the same primal alarms in our brain. It's not weakness, it's survival. But in the modern world, those alarms often get misinterpreted. Being alone doesn't always mean you're unsafe. Yet your nervous system might still whisper, "Fix this, find someone, escape the quiet." This is where the double-edged sword appears. On one side, loneliness can hurt. Prolonged isolation has been linked to anxiety, depression, even physical health problems. The body and mind respond to that lack of connection as if it were starvation. But on the other side, chosen solitude can heal. It can reset the nervous system, slow down your thoughts, and remind you that you are enough, even without constant validation. So, ask yourself, which blade of loneliness are you holding right now? Is it cutting into you, leaving you restless and uneasy? Or is it carving space, making room for something deeper to emerge? And here's where the paradox lies. Often, the very thing that makes loneliness painful is also what makes it powerful. The silence that hurts is the same silence that allows you to hear what you've been drowning out. The stillness that feels suffocating is the same stillness that can anchor you in a world spinning too fast. As you think about this, don't try to fix it. Just notice. Where does loneliness live in your life? Does it creep in at night when everything is quiet? Does it follow you even in daylight, in conversations that feel empty? Or does it appear only when you're forced to sit with yourself for longer than a few moments? Understanding this duality is the first step toward transforming it. Loneliness doesn't have to remain a shadow. It can become a doorway. And once you learn to step through, you begin to see that being alone isn't always what you thought. And with that reflection, let's gently move toward the next idea. Because if loneliness is a mirror, then what we see inside of it depends on how we frame our own story. The hidden stories we tell ourselves in solitude. If loneliness is a mirror, then the next question becomes, what do we actually see when we look into it? And perhaps more importantly, what do we tell ourselves about what we see? Because loneliness is rarely just an experience, it's a narrative. The mind doesn't like empty spaces, so it fills the silence with stories. When you sit alone at night, maybe you whisper to yourself, "I'm alone because I'm not lovable." Or, "I'm alone because I've failed." Or perhaps, "I'm alone because no one understands me." These are not facts, though they feel like it in the moment. They are interpretations, frames that you've unconsciously chosen. And the more you repeat them, the more real they become. Psychologists call this narrative identity. In simple terms, It's the story you build about your life to make sense of it. And loneliness is one of those chapters where the story often darkens. We rarely tell ourselves, I'm alone because I'm growing, or I'm alone because I need space to heal. Yet those are also truths, just less practiced ones. The human brain is designed to find meaning. That's why a person staring at the ceiling in solitude can feel as though they're trapped, while another person in the same situation can feel liberated. The difference isn't the reality, it's the story wrapped around it. And here's the twist. The story doesn't just describe your experience, it shapes it. If you keep telling yourself that being alone means being abandoned, your body will respond with stress, anxiety, even physical pain. But if you begin to shift that narrative, slowly, gently, into one where solitude becomes opportunity, then your body starts to calm. The loneliness doesn't vanish, but it transforms. Let me offer an image. Imagine two people walking through the exact same forest. One has been told stories of monsters lurking in the shadows. The other has been told stories of hidden treasures buried beneath the trees. They walk the same path, but their experiences are completely different. Loneliness works the same way. The story you carry changes the ground you walk on. Now, this doesn't mean you can simply positive think your way out of loneliness. That will be too shallow. The truth is, some stories are deeply ingrained. Maybe they come from childhood, where being alone really was painful. Maybe they come from heartbreak, from betrayal, from times when silence wasn't peaceful but terrifying. Those stories leave traces, and to pretend they don't exist would only push them deeper. But what you can do, what solitude allows, is the chance to hear those stories clearly, maybe for the first time. When you're not drowned out by conversations, notifications, and noise, the raw voice of your inner narrative becomes audible. And that's when you have the opportunity to question it, to ask, is this story really true? Or is it just old? For example, if your story is, I'm alone because no one wants me, you might pause and realize, actually, there are people who care about you, but perhaps you've withdrawn from them. Or maybe you realize the story isn't about others at all. It's about your own fear of intimacy, your own hesitation to open the door. It's in those moments of questioning that loneliness begins to shift from enemy to guide. Because now, instead of running from the feeling, you're listening to what it's teaching you. And here lies the strange paradox again. Sometimes the story of loneliness isn't about the present at all. It's about the past you haven't fully processed. The empty room becomes a stage where old memories play themselves out. Childhood moments, breakups, the times you felt invisible. They echo louder when no one else is around. But maybe that's not a curse. Maybe that's the psyche's way of saying, look at this now, so you don't carry it forever. Think of solitude then, as a rehearsal space. It's where you get to rewrite, reframe, and retell. Not to deny the pain, but to expand beyond it. To say, yes, loneliness hurts, but it also tells me something about what I value, what I long for, what I haven't yet given myself. And that realization begins to change how you meet the world. Because once you've sat with loneliness and asked it what it wants you to know, connection itself becomes different. Relationships are no longer just a way to fill silence. They become a choice, a creation, an enrichment. So, the next time you find yourself alone, instead of asking, why me? Try asking, what story am I telling myself right now? And is there another story just as true that I could tell instead? And this question naturally leads us further. Because if loneliness is shaped by stories, then the next step is to understand the role of self-awareness. What does it really mean to be present with yourself, without distraction, without escape? That's where we'll turn next. Self-awareness. Meeting yourself in the quiet. If the stories we tell ourselves shape the experience of loneliness, then self-awareness is the light we carry into the darkened room. It is the difference between being lost in your own narrative and realizing, I am the one telling it. Self-awareness in solitude isn't just noticing that you're alone, it's becoming curious about what exactly rises to the surface when everything else falls away. When the phone is off, when the conversation ends, when the lights dim, what fills that silence? Is it restlessness? Is it longing? Is it peace? Or is it a kind of buzzing anxiety, like the mind doesn't know how to sit still? Most people never truly discover this, because they rarely give themselves enough uninterrupted quiet to notice. Life provides endless distractions: streaming, scrolling, working, talking. Each distraction acts like a wall between you and yourself, and loneliness, in its rawest form, breaks those walls. It forces you to face the unfiltered version of who you are. That confrontation can feel unbearable at first. Many run from it, but if you stay, if you sit long enough with the discomfort, you start to notice details that you've overlooked. Maybe you realize that you're harsher on yourself than you ever knew. Maybe you notice the endless comparisons, the quiet self-criticism, the standards you hold yourself to. Or maybe you discover something gentler, that beneath the chatter, there is a part of you that simply wants rest, or to be seen, or to be understood. Self-awareness is like adjusting your eyes in the dark. At first, all you see is blackness and absence. But if you let your gaze soften, if you allow the silence to expand, you start to see shapes forming, the outlines of feelings, the patterns of thoughts, the hidden currents of desire and fear. Loneliness, in this sense, is not emptiness, it is clarity. Think of it this way. When you are constantly surrounded by others, it is easy to lose track of where you end and they begin. You absorb moods, you adapt roles, you perform versions of yourself that fit each context. But solitude strips that away. Alone, you have no audience, no script, no one to impress. What you encounter is the raw, unperformed self. And sometimes that self surprises you. For example, maybe you always thought of yourself as social, outgoing, dependent on interaction. But in true solitude, you find a hidden well of creativity that emerges only in silence. Or perhaps the opposite. You thought you were independent, self-sufficient. But in solitude, you feel an ache for connection that reveals just how much you need others. Self-awareness doesn't always confirm who you thought you were. More often, it challenges it. Psychologists suggest that solitude activates what's called self-referential processing, the brain turning its gaze inward. That's why people often describe epiphanies in quiet moments, in the shower, on a long walk, lying awake at night. The absence of noise allows the deeper patterns of thought to emerge. Loneliness magnifies this because it strips away external validation. Suddenly, you're left with the raw question, who am I when no one is watching? It's a daunting question, but it is also one of the most important, because until you can answer it, at least partially, you can never enter relationships freely. Without self-awareness, you risk molding yourself to the desires of others, losing track of your own boundaries, your own needs. Loneliness, though painful, offers the exact environment in which you can begin to discover those boundaries. Here's a thought experiment. Imagine yourself sitting in a quiet room for an entire day. No phone, no books, no conversations, just you. At first, the hours crawl. Your mind itches for escape, but eventually, you start to notice something. Your thoughts settle into rhythms, your body begins to relax, and feelings you've buried begin to surface. Maybe grief, maybe joy, maybe regret. What you are experiencing in that moment is not emptiness. It is yourself, unveiled. And this is where loneliness shifts from punishment to invitation. It is not just a void, it is a mirror. It gives you the rare opportunity to ask questions most people spend their entire lives avoiding. Questions like, what do I actually value? What am I hiding from? What would I do if there were no one to judge me? These questions don't always have easy answers, but they are the kind of questions that shape a life. Of course, this isn't to romanticize loneliness. Sometimes self-awareness in solitude reveals wounds, traumas, memories that hurt. But even then, there is a strange gift. At least now you can see them. At least now they aren't festering in the dark. Awareness is the first step toward transformation. So, when loneliness arrives, instead of asking, how do I get rid of this? Perhaps the deeper question is, what is this showing me about myself? Because every moment alone is a mirror, sometimes distorted, sometimes brutally honest, but always a chance to see more clearly. And once you begin to see yourself more clearly, something subtle happens. The way you connect with others begins to shift as well. Self-awareness becomes the bridge between solitude and meaningful connection. Which brings us naturally to the next exploration, how being alone reshapes the way we enter relationships. How solitude shapes relationships. It may seem counterintuitive, but the quality of your relationships often has less to do with how much time you spend with others, and more to do with how comfortable you are when you're by yourself. Loneliness, in this sense, is not only a personal experience, it is relational training. Think about it. If you cannot stand your own company, you will never enter a relationship from a place of fullness. You will enter from need. You will look to the other person to fill the silence you avoid, to distract you from your own inner restlessness, to validate you in ways you have not yet learned to validate yourself. And when that happens, relationships become heavy. They bend under the weight of expectation. But when you have faced solitude, when you've sat long enough with loneliness to discover what it really holds, you no longer demand that another person fix what you fear. You stop approaching relationships as rescue missions. Instead, you approach them as true connections. Two whole beings choosing to share space, not two incomplete beings using each other to fill a void. This is one of the paradoxes of loneliness. The very thing that feels like absence is what prepares you for genuine presence with another. When you have learned to befriend yourself, you no longer fear abandonment in the same way. You realize, if they leave, I am still here, and that is enough. That realization transforms the entire dynamic of intimacy. It replaces clinging with openness, desperation with depth. Consider how many toxic patterns emerge from the fear of being alone, staying in relationships long past their health, chasing attention for validation, compromising values just to belong. These are all attempts to escape loneliness rather than confront it, but solitude forces you to face the fear directly. And once you do, relationships no longer hold you hostage. They become choices, not cages. There's a psychological principle here called differentiation of self. It refers to the ability to hold on to your identity even in close connection with others. People with low differentiation collapse into whoever they're with. They lose their boundaries. They fear conflict because conflict threatens the bond they rely on for a sense of self. But people with a high differentiation, those who have met themselves in solitude, bring a stable sense of identity into the relationship. They don't merge entirely. They don't lose themselves. They remain individuals capable of both intimacy and independence. And this independence doesn't weaken love, it deepens it. Because love that comes from freedom, not fear, is love without chains. It is the difference between saying, "I need you to survive," and saying, "I choose you even though I could survive without you." The latter is far more powerful. Let's pause here and reflect. Imagine two people sitting together in silence. One has never learned to tolerate their own loneliness. Silence terrifies them. They squirm, fill the air with chatter, grasp for reassurance. The other has met themselves in solitude. Silence doesn't scare them. They sit comfortably, present, calm. Which of these dynamics feels more nourishing? Which one feels safe? True intimacy is not born in constant noise. It's born in the quiet spaces where two people can sit side by side with no need to prove, no fear of emptiness, because each has already befriended their own solitude. This is why solitude is not just a personal experience, it is relational training. It teaches you how to listen without projecting, how to love without demanding, how to remain even when the other person cannot soothe every ache you carry. Loneliness, when embraced, becomes the teacher of patience, of boundaries, of genuine connection. But let's go deeper still. Because beyond shaping relationships, solitude also has another secret. It is the birthplace of creativity, insight, and vision. When you are alone, the mind doesn't just rest. It begins to wander, to imagine, to connect patterns in ways it never could in constant company. And so, having explored how solitude transforms the way we love, let us now move into its role as a wellspring of creativity. The creative power of loneliness. When people imagine loneliness, they usually picture emptiness, an absence, a lack. But what if I told you that this very absence is the same fertile ground from which human creativity has always grown? Solitude is not only about healing your relationship with yourself, it is also the forge where ideas, visions, and breakthroughs are born. History whispers this truth over and over. Great works of art, scientific discoveries, revolutionary philosophies. They almost always begin with someone stepping away from the crowd. From Van Gogh painting alone in his studio, to Newton sitting in isolation during the plague years, to countless poets, thinkers, and inventors who first turned inward before they could offer something outward. Loneliness has always been misunderstood. It is not just emptiness, but space. And space is what the imagination requires to breathe. Think about your own life for a moment. When do the most surprising thoughts appear? Rarely in the middle of a crowded room. More often it happens in the quiet, when you're lying awake in bed, walking alone at dusk, staring out of a window while the world slows. In those moments, something stirs. The mind connects dots it had never connected before. A new idea rises unannounced, as if from nowhere. But it didn't come from nowhere. It came from the silence you allowed. Psychologists call this the incubation effect. When your mind is not distracted by constant noise, it shifts into a different mode of processing. It begins to wander freely, combining fragments of memory, knowledge, and imagination into something entirely new. Solitude creates the stage for this incubation. Without it, creativity suffocates under the weight of distraction. But here is the paradox. Most people fear loneliness so deeply that they run from it before its gifts can surface. They flood every quiet space with stimulation, scrolling, chatting, consuming. In doing so, they escape not only the discomfort, but also the creativity hidden beneath it. Loneliness feels unbearable at first because it strips away distraction. Yet, if you can sit with it, remain present, and allow the silence to deepen, it transforms. What first felt like a void becomes a canvas. And that canvas is what allows you to paint visions no one else can see. Creativity is not a product of constant interaction. It is a product of reflection, of turning inward long enough for the unspoken to take shape. This is why so many breakthroughs happen not during group discussions, but in the solitude that follows them. Consider the artists who create their masterpieces not when surrounded by applause, but in hours of solitude where no one is watching. Or the thinkers whose most profound insights come not in conversation, but in solitary walks through fields, forests, or empty streets. Loneliness, though painful, sharpens attention. It strips away superficial noise and leaves you with raw experience, the perfect material for creation. And yet, this doesn't mean you need to become a hermit to be creative. It means you must learn to value and embrace the pockets of solitude you already encounter. The time before sleep, the pause in your commute, the moment when you're alone with your thoughts instead of rushing to fill them. Those are the moments where creativity hides. Those are the moments where solitude turns from emptiness into revelation. So, ask yourself, what might emerge if you stopped fearing loneliness and started listening to it? What ideas are waiting behind the silence? What part of yourself longs to speak, if only given the space? Because here lies the truth. The world's most extraordinary creations are not born from endless company, but from those who dared to enter the quiet and return with something worth sharing. And as we reflect on creativity, we uncover yet another secret of solitude. Not only does it shape love and innovation, but it also serves as a mirror in which you can see the parts of yourself hidden by constant distraction, a mirror that reflects truths you may not want to face, but must if you are to grow. Loneliness as a mirror of the self. Solitude does something most people are not prepared for. It holds up a mirror, and not a flattering mirror that shows you only what you want to see, but a brutally honest one. When you are alone, without distractions, without anyone else's voice to drown out your own, you begin to meet yourself, fully, directly, and without escape. For many, this is the true source of discomfort. Loneliness doesn't just mean the absence of others, it means the presence of yourself. And that presence can be overwhelming. You may notice the thoughts you usually push aside, regrets that linger, insecurities that echo, desires you've never admitted. Alone, in silence, there is nowhere to run from them. Psychologists describe this as self-confrontation. In daily life, we are shielded by a constant flow of activity, conversation, and distraction. But when stripped of those shields, what remains is the unfiltered reality of who you are. Some discover they feel restless without external validation. Others notice a deep unease, as if their own company is somehow not enough. Loneliness magnifies these truths, forcing you to recognize patterns that otherwise hide in the background. But here lies the paradox. This confrontation, while painful, is also the gateway to transformation. You cannot change what you refuse to face. Loneliness, therefore, becomes not just a source of suffering, but a teacher. It whispers, "This is you. Do you see yourself clearly? Do you want to remain this way? Or is it time to evolve?" Many people fear this mirror because it reveals the fragility beneath the masks they wear. The confident exterior may crumble when confronted with solitude. The successful image may blur when alone with private doubts. But here is the deeper truth. To integrate these hidden parts is to gain wholeness. The loneliness that once felt unbearable becomes the crucible in which authenticity is born. Think about it. When was the last time you were truly alone, without music, without a screen, without reaching for your phone? And what rose in that silence? Was it boredom, anxiety, or perhaps a faint but powerful awareness of something you had long avoided? Those moments are not meaningless. They are signposts pointing toward the inner work your soul is calling for. In solitude, you may discover that much of your unhappiness is not about others abandoning you, but about abandoning yourself. Perhaps you neglected your own needs while chasing approval. Perhaps you silenced your voice to fit in. Loneliness makes this absence obvious. It reveals where you have been unfaithful to yourself. And that realization, though painful, is also liberating. Because once you see it, you can begin to repair it. This is why solitude is often described in spiritual traditions as a path to enlightenment. The Desert Fathers, the monks, the mystics, they did not retreat from the world simply to suffer in silence. They retreated because they knew that in facing themselves fully, they would uncover truths hidden from those forever surrounded by noise. Solitude becomes a sacred mirror, reflecting not just your wounds, but also your potential. And so, loneliness is not merely a curse. It is a call to stop running, to stop distracting, to stop hiding behind others. It is an invitation to look inward with courage, to meet your own gaze without flinching. Only then can you begin the work of transformation. But the story does not end here, because if loneliness is a mirror, it is also a map. Once you recognize what it reveals, you can use that awareness to chart a new path, one where solitude becomes not punishment, but empowerment. And that path leads us to something even deeper, the way loneliness teaches us resilience, emotional strength, and the capacity to endure life's storms without collapsing. Loneliness as the forge of resilience. When most people think of resilience, they imagine pushing through challenges with external support. Friends cheering you on, loved ones providing comfort, mentors guiding the way. And while those sources of support are invaluable, there is another kind of resilience that is far rarer and far more unshakable. The resilience born in solitude. Loneliness, though deeply uncomfortable, functions like a forge. It takes the raw material of your vulnerability and exposes it to heat and pressure until something harder, something more enduring, is formed. When you sit with loneliness without running from it, you discover a strength you didn't know you had. The strength to be enough on your own. Psychologists have studied this phenomenon under concepts like distress tolerance and emotional regulation. Essentially, the more time you spend enduring solitude, the more your nervous system adapts to it. At first, the quiet feels unbearable. You reach for your phone, you crave a distraction, you want someone to validate your existence. But as you practice staying in that space, you learn that the silence doesn't destroy you. The craving passes. The panic dissolves. And what remains is a quiet resilience, proof that you can face discomfort and survive. This is not weakness, it's training. Loneliness becomes like a gym for the mind and the soul. Every moment you endure it without collapse is a rep, a strengthening of muscles you didn't know you were building. And those muscles, once developed, extend into every other area of life. Suddenly, you can handle rejection without shattering. You can endure uncertainty without spiraling. You can face grief, heartbreak, and disappointment with a steadiness that surprises even you. But let's not romanticize this too quickly. Loneliness is not pleasant. It can feel like a wound that refuses to heal. Yet, just as the body grows stronger after healing from an injury, the psyche grows stronger after enduring the ache of solitude. Each time you sit through that ache, you are teaching yourself, I can survive emptiness. I can exist even when no one else is here to confirm me. I am enough to fill my own space. This is where resilience transforms into something deeper, emotional independence. When you no longer rely on constant external affirmation to stabilize your mood, you become unshakable. Other people can leave, situations can crumble, but you remain intact because you have already faced the darkest nights of loneliness and discovered that you were still whole at the dawn. And here lies one of the paradoxical gifts of loneliness. It prepares you for connection. Think about it. If you enter relationships out of desperation, because you cannot tolerate being alone, you will inevitably cling, compromise, and suffocate the bond. But if you have endured loneliness and learned resilience within it, then you no longer need relationships to survive. You choose them freely and authentically. You are not enslaved by fear of abandonment because you know you can withstand solitude. This is the kind of strength that makes love purer, not weaker. Consider also how resilience born in loneliness reshapes your sense of time. In a world obsessed with constant activity, most people panic at the thought of empty hours. But those who have befriended solitude no longer dread the empty calendar. They see it as possibility, not punishment. They fill their hours with creation, reflection, or quiet joy, rather than anxiously seeking distraction. And perhaps most importantly, resilience formed in loneliness creates an inner sanctuary that no external chaos can touch. The storms of life, loss, rejection, uncertainty will always come. But if you have cultivated resilience in solitude, those storms cannot uproot you. You may bend, but you will not break, because you already know how to stand alone. So, loneliness, when embraced, becomes a training ground for a stronger, calmer, more centered self. And yet, resilience is only one of its lessons. There is another, more surprising transformation that emerges from solitude, something few expect, but everyone secretly longs for. It is the way loneliness, once endured, can transmute into creativity, vision, and the ability to shape an inner world so rich it eclipses the outer one. Loneliness as a catalyst for creativity. There is a strange truth about human history. Some of the greatest works of art, philosophy, and innovation were not born in crowded rooms or lively conversations, but in solitude. The artist at their desk, the poet pacing in silence, the thinker staring out into nothing. Loneliness, while painful, often becomes the crucible for creativity. Why? Because when the noise of the world falls away, when you are left only with yourself, your mind begins to search for new ways to fill the silence. The conversations you no longer have with others become conversations with yourself. The energy you once spent reaching outward turns inward, shaping images, stories, and ideas. Loneliness forces the imagination to wake up, to become active in ways it rarely does when life is full of constant stimulation. Neuroscientists have studied what happens in the brain during these moments. When external input is low, the brain shifts into what's known as the default mode network. This is the system that activates when you are daydreaming, reflecting, or simply letting your mind wander. And it is in this mode that creativity flourishes. Solitude in this sense is not emptiness. It is fertile ground for imagination to take root. Think of the countless creators who found inspiration in isolation. Friedrich Nietzsche writing in the mountains, far from the noise of society. Emily Dickinson, who lived most of her life in solitude, pouring her inner world into poetry. Nikola Tesla, who spoke of the necessity of being alone to hatch new ideas. Again and again, loneliness and creativity walk hand in hand. But you don't have to be a genius or an artist to experience this. Every human being, when faced with silence, begins to build inner worlds. Maybe you start imagining scenarios, replaying memories, or dreaming of futures that don't yet exist. Loneliness becomes the stage where your imagination performs, and over time, that performance strengthens your capacity for vision, problem solving, and innovation. It's important, though, to note the duality here. Loneliness can crush creativity just as easily as it can ignite it, depending on how you meet it. If you resist loneliness, drowning it in distractions, the silence becomes suffocating. But if you lean into it, if you sit with the discomfort and allow your mind to wander freely, the silence becomes generative. It becomes a space where something new can be born. Psychologists sometimes call this productive solitude. It's not about isolating yourself out of bitterness or despair. It's about using solitude intentionally, about recognizing that the moments when you are most alone can also be the moments when your inner voice is loudest, clearest, and most imaginative. Consider the simple act of journaling. When you sit alone with a blank page, you are not just recording thoughts, you are creating. Your loneliness takes shape as words, as ideas, as reflections. That same process can extend into music, painting, business ideas, or even personal insights. Loneliness, then, becomes not a void, but a canvas. And here's the deeper secret. The creativity born in loneliness often feels more authentic than the creativity born under pressure, because it is not made for applause, not designed for an audience. It is born out of necessity, out of the need to fill the silence with meaning. And because of that, it often reveals parts of yourself you didn't know existed. But creativity is not the only gift that emerges from loneliness. There is another transformation, quieter and more subtle, yet equally profound. After resilience, after creativity, loneliness can give birth to a third gift, clarity. When you spend enough time in solitude, you begin to see not just what you can create, but who you truly are beneath all the noise. Loneliness as a mirror of clarity and self-discovery. When the voices of the world grow silent, you are left with only one voice, your own. And for many people, this is where loneliness becomes unbearable. Not because of the silence itself, but because of what emerges inside it. Truths we have long ignored, emotions we have buried, and questions we have been too busy to ask. Loneliness acts like a mirror. In the quiet, it reflects back not only who we think we are, but also who we really are beneath the roles, masks, and performances we put on for others. For the first time, without distraction, you are forced to sit with yourself. And in that encounter, clarity often arises. Think about how much of daily life is filled with noise, notifications, conversations, obligations, the constant rush of input. Each interaction pulls you slightly away from yourself. You adapt, you perform, you compromise. Slowly, almost invisibly, the sense of who am I becomes tangled in who others expect you to be. But when you are lonely, the expectations vanish. No one is watching, no one is asking anything of you. And so the questions return. Who am I, really? What do I want? What do I believe? This is the gift hidden inside loneliness. It gives you space to remember yourself. Psychologists call this self-concept clarity, the degree to which you have a stable, confident sense of who you are. And studies have shown that solitude, though uncomfortable at first, can dramatically increase this clarity. Because when you are stripped of external validation, you are forced to define yourself from within. Consider a person who has always defined themselves by relationships, the loyal friend, the devoted partner, the reliable colleague. Suddenly they find themselves alone. At first, it feels like an identity crisis. If no one is around to affirm these roles, then who are they? But if they stay in that loneliness long enough, something remarkable happens. They discover that they are more than those roles. They find interests, values, and strengths that exist independently of others. The loneliness becomes the forge where a more authentic self is shaped. Spiritual traditions across cultures have long recognized this process. Monks retreat to monasteries, sages withdraw into deserts, seekers go on pilgrimages, not because isolation itself is the goal, but because in solitude the veil between the surface self and the deeper self grows thin. Loneliness forces a confrontation with the parts of yourself that you have avoided. And though this confrontation is often painful, it is also illuminating. You may realize that certain dreams you've been chasing were never truly yours. They were given to you by society, family, or peers. You may notice that your coping mechanisms, overwork, constant busyness, even certain relationships, were distractions from wounds you never wanted to face. Loneliness lays these truths bare, and in that bareness, you have the opportunity to choose again. This clarity is not abstract. It shows up in the smallest of ways. Maybe in loneliness you realize you actually enjoyed the quiet of a morning without your phone. Maybe you discover that a walk in nature brings more peace than a crowded night out. Maybe you recognize that the person you've been trying so hard to please doesn't actually align with your values. These insights, small at first, accumulate. They begin to reorient your life towards something more authentic. But clarity is not just about discovering what is true. It is also about shedding what is false. Loneliness gives you permission to let go of identities that no longer fit, to release relationships that only exist out of habit, to step away from the constant need to prove yourself. In the quiet, you realize that much of what you thought was necessary is not. And in that realization, freedom begins to take shape. Of course, clarity does not arrive instantly. At first, loneliness clouds the mind with fear, confusion, even despair. You may feel restless, agitated, desperate for escape. But if you endure those first waves, if you resist the urge to numb yourself with distractions, a shift happens. The fog clears. And in its place is a vision of yourself that is sharper, simpler, and truer than before. Clarity is the foundation of transformation. Without it, resilience has no direction and creativity has no anchor. But with it, loneliness ceases to be an enemy and becomes a teacher. A teacher that asks only one thing: are you willing to face yourself? And once you begin to see yourself clearly, a new question emerges. Not just, who am I? But also, who do I want to become? Because clarity is not only about understanding the past or present, it is about shaping the future. And that is where the next transformation lies. Loneliness not only shows you who you are, it challenges you to grow into who you could be. Solitude as an unseen architect of the self. When you are alone, you are not simply without others. Something far more intricate is happening beneath the surface. Solitude itself begins to act as an architect, slowly and silently shaping the foundation of your identity, your values, and even the way you interpret reality. And unlike the noisy influence of society, this shaping occurs without permission, without announcement. It just happens. Think of how most people construct themselves. They borrow pieces, a laugh taken from a friend, a belief absorbed from a parent, a goal whispered by culture until it sounds like their own dream. Day by day, these fragments pile up until the individual is less an individual and more a collage of external influences. In constant company, it is difficult, almost impossible, to hear your own original voice underneath the chorus. But when you are alone, that chorus fades, and in the silence, something different stirs. You begin to notice which thoughts are truly yours and which are echoes. This process is not comfortable. In fact, it can be unsettling, even frightening. Many avoid solitude precisely because it reveals how little of themselves has been consciously chosen. Yet within that fear lies the possibility of freedom. Freedom here does not mean the absence of all influence. It means the ability to discern, to notice. This belief I keep, this expectation I release. Alone, you begin the slow act of pruning, trimming away the parts of yourself that never belonged to you in the first place. This is not easy work. It requires honesty, and honesty is heavy. But every moment of solitude is another brick laid in the structure of a self that is actually yours. Isolation also functions as a mirror. It shows you not only who you are, but what you crave most deeply. For many, this revelation is disorienting. When distractions fall away, when no one is performing for you and you for them, the raw hunger of your own desires emerges. Sometimes it is a desire for connection, sometimes for meaning, sometimes for escape. Often, it is not what you expected. This is why solitude can feel like exposure. It strips away pretense. It forces you to see the distance between who you are and who you want to be. And in that distance, transformation becomes possible. Without solitude, desire remains unconscious, buried under busyness. With it, desire becomes a compass, pointing relentlessly toward the life you are meant to create. Another dimension of solitude is its capacity to discipline the mind. Consider how, in company, your attention fragments. Notifications, conversations, obligations. Each demands a piece of you. Alone, you confront a different challenge. Nothing external is directing your focus. You must learn to steer it yourself. At first, this feels impossible. The mind thrashes, searching for stimulation. Boredom gnaws. Restlessness spreads. But over time, solitude teaches concentration. It reveals that attention is not just a passive reaction. It is a skill to be trained. Those who master it discover that they can create order in their inner world, even when the outer world is chaotic. And that mastery is one of the most underrated forms of power. This is why so many great thinkers, writers, and innovators spoke of the necessity of solitude. Not because loneliness is romantic, but because it forces discipline. It teaches you how to hold an idea in your mind without scattering. It teaches you how to endure silence long enough to hear what others miss. It is, in a way, a furnace. burning away distraction until only focus remains. And yet, solitude is not only practical. At its deepest, it borders on the spiritual. Extended loneliness has a way of bending perception. The ordinary begins to shift. You start to notice subtleties, the rhythm of your own breathing, the texture of light on the wall, the strange weight of passing time. These small details, usually drowned out by noise, begin to glow with significance. Some traditions describe this as transcendence, the moment when loneliness ceases to feel like deprivation and becomes instead a form of communion, not with people, but with existence itself. In solitude, you realize you are not entirely alone, because you are accompanied by the vastness of being, the sky, the earth, the hidden depth of your own mind. Loneliness, once feared, becomes a bridge. And this is where solitude becomes more than survival, more than growth. It becomes revelation. It teaches you that your worth, your meaning, your peace do not depend on constant interaction. They are already here, waiting, uncovered only when silence stretches long enough to reveal them. From here, we can naturally shift toward how loneliness doesn't just shape the individual, it transforms the way relationships themselves function once you return to them. How solitude resets the way you love and relate. Loneliness does not only affect the self in isolation, it alters the entire architecture of how we relate to others once we return from being alone. Too often, relationships are approached like habits, automatic, unconscious, almost mechanical. But solitude interrupts this rhythm. It dismantles the patterns you have rehearsed with others, forcing a reset. And when you come back, you notice things you never noticed before. In company, affection can blur with dependency. Attention can blur with genuine care. Attraction can blur with projection. Alone, these blurs sharpen. You begin to realize the difference between needing someone and choosing someone. That distinction is not subtle, it is transformative. When you are starved of company, your longing makes you examine what kind of presence actually nourishes you. Not the superficial gestures, not the empty noise, but the rare and authentic resonance that makes another person feel like gravity. Something you orbit willingly, not out of necessity. Think of solitude as a filter. When someone is gone from your daily life, what remains in your mind about them is revealing. For some, the absence amplifies irritation. You remember their interruptions, their weight, the things you tolerated rather than cherished. For others, absence magnifies tenderness. You find yourself recalling the smallest details, the way their laugh disarmed you, the steadiness of their presence. Loneliness, therefore, doesn't just test your patience, it tests the authenticity of your bonds. If a connection withers in absence, it was never truly alive. If it deepens, then absence has revealed its truth. In this sense, solitude spares you the illusions that constant presence can generate. It strips relationships down to their essence. Another shift loneliness provokes is in the way intimacy is experienced. When you have been alone, even the smallest interaction feels amplified. A casual smile, a simple conversation, a touch on the shoulder, suddenly these gestures vibrate with intensity. Solitude recalibrates sensitivity, almost like fasting sharpens the taste of food. And this recalibration has consequences. It means that those who embrace solitude often return to others with an unusual capacity for gratitude. They are no longer dulled by overstimulation. They recognize the value of closeness because they have lived without it. Paradoxically, it is those who are most comfortable being alone who are most capable of appreciating true intimacy when it arrives. Perhaps the most radical transformation solitude offers is liberation from desperation. When people cannot bear loneliness, they accept almost any form of company, even if it is destructive. They endure toxic relationships, shallow entanglements, or connections that drain more than they give. Why? Because silence terrifies them. The emptiness feels unbearable, so they fill it with whatever is at hand. But when you have lived through loneliness, sat with it, endured it, made peace with it, you are no longer enslaved to that desperation. You can walk away from what does not serve you. You can say no without fear. You no longer confuse presence with love. This is power, not the power of domination, but the power of self-possession. It means that when you love by choice, not by need. Seen in this way, solitude is not an enemy of connection, but its precondition. It clears the ground, removes the weeds of dependency, and allows genuine closeness to grow. It teaches you that relationships are not about escaping yourself, but about expanding yourself. Not about silencing your loneliness, but about finding someone with whom solitude becomes shared rather than erased. And so, loneliness reshapes the map of intimacy itself. It alters what you seek, what you tolerate, and what you offer. It makes your love more deliberate, your boundaries clearer, and your appreciation sharper. Far from isolating you forever, solitude refines the way you belong. From here, we can flow seamlessly into a new angle, the strange way loneliness distorts time and memory, bending your perception of reality itself. Loneliness and the distortion of time. Time does not flow evenly. This is something we rarely notice when life is filled with noise, interaction, and movement. But in solitude, stripped of distraction, time reveals its elasticity. Minutes stretch like hours. Days collapse into blurs. Nights expand endlessly, as if the clock itself hesitates to move forward. Loneliness heightens this distortion. It makes you hyper-aware of the absence of others, and with no external rhythm to anchor you, the mind begins to bend time according to its own emotional weight. An evening spent alone can feel eternal, while weeks of solitude may vanish into a haze, leaving you disoriented, unsure of how much has truly passed. Why does loneliness warp time so powerfully? Because human beings measure their lives not only in hours and days, but in encounters. A conversation, a shared meal, an argument, a laugh. These moments punctuate the stream of time, marking it with significance. Without them, the flow loses structure. It becomes like an ocean without landmarks. You drift, and the drifting itself distorts perception. This is why solitary confinement is considered one of the most psychologically punishing experiences. It's not just the absence of people, but the collapse of time into a flat, unbearable sameness. Loneliness magnifies that same collapse on a subtler level, where each day feels indistinguishable from the last. There is another, deeper layer. Memory itself begins to shift under loneliness. When you are alone, your mind often replays interactions with others, sometimes vividly, sometimes with subtle distortions. A small kindness grows monumental, a tiny slight becomes unbearable, a neutral gesture is exaggerated into meaning. Memory does not remain static, it mutates under the pressure of solitude. And because memory is one of the ways we anchor our sense of time, its distortions make the timeline unstable. You might dwell obsessively on a moment that happened years ago until it feels as fresh as yesterday. Or you might find entire weeks slipping away unremembered, as if they dissolved in the emptiness. Loneliness collapses the past into the present, creating loops that feel endless. Loneliness also creates the sensation of waiting for someone to call, for something to change, for life to resume. But waiting itself expands time. Think of how a few minutes in anticipation feel infinitely longer than the same minutes spent in distraction. This is why loneliness can feel unbearable. It isn't just being alone, it is the sense of waiting for an end to it. And that waiting stretches every moment into something heavier, denser, harder to endure. But there is an insight hidden inside this discomfort. Waiting forces awareness of time's texture, of its subtle folds and currents. It makes you conscious of the difference between passive endurance and active living. And sometimes, in recognizing this, people discover how to stop waiting altogether. They learn to act, to create, to explore even within solitude. This is how loneliness, paradoxically, can awaken vitality, by making the weight of time so intense that one must either collapse under it or transform it. There is something almost cosmic about how nights feel in loneliness. Without the grounding presence of another person, the silence thickens, and hours after midnight seem suspended outside of time. The ticking of a clock, the hum of a refrigerator, the faint sound of distant traffic, all become unbearably loud reminders of emptiness. Nights in loneliness are not just dark, they are endless. And yet, many report that it is in these endless nights that the deepest reflections arrive. The distortions of time open a doorway to thoughts that would never emerge in the daytime rush. Philosophical questions, creative visions, even painful realizations, all are born in these stretched, lonely hours. The very distortion that torments also creates the conditions for insight. The crucial shift comes when a person realizes they can use these distortions rather than suffer them. If loneliness makes time stretch, that stretching can become a canvas. Instead of waiting for it to pass, one can fill it, writing, creating, meditating, reflecting. What once felt unbearable becomes an opening. Solitude ceases to be prison and becomes laboratory. Time distorted by loneliness is time revealed. It shows us that the clock is not absolute, but filtered through the weight of our emotions. And once you understand that, you are no longer fully captive to it. You can learn to navigate the slowness, to embrace the expansion, and even to find beauty in hours that once felt unbearable. From here, we can flow into a new angle. How loneliness doesn't only warp time, but also reshapes perception, making ordinary environments look uncanny, dreamlike, or even threatening. The altered perceptions of loneliness. Loneliness does not only change how we experience time, it alters the very way we perceive the world around us. Isolation reshapes the senses, bends the atmosphere of familiar places, and creates an entirely different reality than the one you inhabit when surrounded by others. Think of a room you know well. When it is filled with people, it feels ordinary, maybe even comforting. But when you are alone in it for days or weeks, it begins to change. The silence becomes louder than sound. Shadows seem sharper, longer, more alive. Objects you never noticed before draw your attention. The way a curtain shifts slightly in a draft, the ticking pattern of a clock, the creak of wooden floors at night. Loneliness strips away the distractions of human presence, and in their absence, the mind exaggerates the environment. The room does not change, but your perception of it does. What once felt neutral can begin to feel haunted, dreamlike, or strangely unreal. This phenomenon is not fantasy. It's the brain's natural response to prolonged solitude. amplifying details to fill the void left by absent voices and absent energy. One striking feature of loneliness is the way it sharpens the senses. Deprived of social input, the brain becomes hyper-attuned to subtle cues in the environment. The sound of leaves brushing against a window, the faint hum of electronics, the change in light across the wall, all of it feels magnified. This can be disorienting. A creak that would be ignored in company can feel like an intruder's footstep when you are alone. A gust of wind rattling the window can send a rush of adrenaline through your body, because without another person nearby, the weight of responsibility for safety falls entirely on you. Solitude awakens primal instincts, heightening vigilance. But this sensitivity is not only negative. Many artists and thinkers have credited solitude with their deepest perceptions, noticing patterns and subtleties they would never have seen in the noise of social life. Loneliness, in this sense, can peel back layers of the ordinary world and reveal textures usually hidden. In prolonged loneliness, the mind often animates what is lifeless. You may start to talk to objects, imagine presences, or give emotional meaning to sounds. This is not madness. It is the psyche's attempt to restore connection, even if artificially. Humans are wired for social interaction, so when it is absent, the brain compensates by projecting life onto the non-living. Psychologists call this anthropomorphism, the tendency to attribute human qualities to objects or environments. Alone in your apartment, a chair might seem to wait for you, or the house itself might feel like it is watching. It is eerie, but also deeply human. In absence of others, the imagination fills the gap, ensuring that you are never fully without company, even if that company is illusion. Another strange effect of loneliness is the dreamlike quality it gives to perception. Days blur into nights. The sense of what is real and what is imagined can feel less stable. People describe solitary experiences where they begin to question whether time is moving forward, whether the outside world still exists, or whether they themselves are dissolving into the silence. This is not necessarily pathology. It is the natural consequence of a mind unanchored by social exchange. Normally, conversations and interactions reaffirm reality. Someone says, "Good morning," and you know the day has begun. Someone laughs, and you know your joke was real. In loneliness, these confirmations vanish, and without them, reality itself feels fluid, dreamlike, sometimes fragile. Perhaps the most profound aspect of altered perception is that loneliness becomes a mirror. What you see in solitude often reflects what you carry inside. If you are burdened with fear, the empty house feels threatening. If you are filled with longing, the silence feels cruel. If you are creative, the stillness feels like possibility. In this sense, loneliness strips away the external noise and confronts you with your own interior landscape. It amplifies what was already within, forcing you to see it projected outward onto the world around you. That is why two people can endure the same solitude, one experiencing torment, the other discovering peace. The environment does not change, the lens of perception does. And so, loneliness reveals its paradox. What seems like distortion of perception may actually be a gateway to deeper understanding. When the silence grows so heavy that every sound is amplified, you become aware of subtleties normally drowned out. When the familiar becomes uncanny, you are forced to notice the hidden layers of reality. When the mind animates objects or bends reality into dreamlike states, it is not collapsing, but stretching, exploring new ways of perceiving existence. Loneliness, in this sense, is not just absence, it is transformation. It is the chance to see reality with fresh, sometimes unsettling eyes. And while this can be frightening, it can also be profoundly illuminating. The reconstructed self in solitude loneliness is not only about perception of the world, it also reshapes how you see yourself. In the presence of others, your identity is constantly reflected back at you. Every conversation, every subtle reaction, every acknowledgement of your existence reminds you who you are in relation to someone else. But when those mirrors disappear, when you are left in silence with no one to affirm your role, a subtle unraveling begins. Most people do not realize how much of their identity is relational. You are a friend, a sibling, a partner, a colleague. Even the way you speak is adapted to the expectations of those around you. But in prolonged loneliness, these roles dissolve. No one is present to call your name. No one is there to interpret your tone. No one defines you by function or connection. What remains then when all relational labels are stripped away? For some, this can feel like liberation, a shedding of masks and expectations. For others, it feels like disintegration, as though the very foundation of self has collapsed. This paradox is the heart of loneliness. It can erase you, but it can also reveal you. Without external affirmation, you are left with a question that is both terrifying and freeing. Who am I when no one is watching? This question cuts deeper than philosophy. In the silence, you may notice how much of your self-image was built on pleasing others, fitting roles, or mirroring back what society told you. Alone, those scripts falter. If no one sees you smile, are you still kind? If no one admires your work, are you still capable? If no one remembers your stories, are they still worth telling? Loneliness forces these confrontations, stripping away the scaffolding until you face what cannot be taken from you, the irreducible essence of selfhood. But solitude does not only reveal a noble or authentic core, it also releases what has been hidden. With no one to perform for, shadow aspects of the self can rise. Unexpressed fears, unresolved anger, repressed desires, they all find space to surface. Many people fear being alone precisely because of this. In silence, the thoughts they avoid in daily life become louder. Memories resurface, regrets replay. The hidden corners of the psyche demand attention. Yet, there is an opportunity here. By meeting these shadow selves in solitude, you gain the chance to integrate them, to understand parts of yourself that the busyness of social life keeps buried. Loneliness can therefore become either a pit of despair or a crucible of transformation, depending on whether you resist or engage with what emerges. One profound insight loneliness teaches is that identity is not as fixed as it feels. Surrounded by people, you may believe your personality is stable, that you are always the same you. But alone, without the constant reinforcement of feedback, you realize how malleable identity actually is. In extended solitude, you may discover new sides of yourself, perhaps more creative, perhaps more melancholic, perhaps more resilient. Roles fall away, but something else forms in their place, a fluid, shifting self that evolves moment by moment. Some find this frightening, others exhilarating. But either way, it reveals a truth hidden in plain sight. You were never a static self to begin with. You were always in motion, always adapting. Loneliness simply makes the process visible. What also becomes clear in solitude is the prominence of the inner voice. In daily life, external voices dominate: friends, coworkers, family, strangers online. But in loneliness, the loudest voice is your own. For some, this is soothing. For others, it is unbearable. The tone of that inner dialogue becomes the tone of your existence. If you are self-critical, loneliness amplifies it until it feels suffocating. If you are gentle with yourself, solitude becomes a place of healing. Over time, loneliness reveals whether you are your own enemy or your own ally. And by confronting this, you gain the chance to change it. Perhaps the deepest gift of loneliness is the possibility of rebuilding identity consciously. When you realize that so much of who you thought you were depended on external validation, you can begin to craft a self rooted not in performance, but in authenticity. This reconstruction is slow, quiet, and often uncomfortable, but it allows you to ask, what values matter to me? Not because others admire them, but because I truly believe in them. What passions would I pursue if no one were watching? What kind of life feels meaningful, even if it is invisible to the world? In this way, loneliness becomes not only a stripping away, but also a recreation. It deconstructs the inherited self and offers the chance to build something more resilient, more honest, more aligned with inner truth. Segment: The strange psychology of time in solitude. There's a curious thing that happens when you're alone for extended periods. Time itself stops behaving the way you expect. Normally, when you're around people, clocks seem almost irrelevant because events anchor your perception. A conversation fills 20 minutes without you noticing. A commute with background chatter seems short. But when you're by yourself, silence magnifies every tick, and the brain loses its anchors. Minutes can feel like hours, and paradoxically, sometimes hours can vanish in a blink. Psychologists studying solitary confinement have noticed this warping effect repeatedly. Individuals often lose their ability to accurately judge how long they've been in isolation. Some underestimate the time, others overestimate it dramatically. It isn't just a trick of the imagination. It's how your neural circuits adapt when sensory and social cues are stripped away. You're no longer checking time by the rhythm of interaction, but by internal cues like heartbeat, hunger, or the faint shift of light in a room. Without external feedback, the brain improvises its own markers, and they are unreliable. This distortion can be unsettling. When alone for long stretches, you may find yourself staring at a wall for what feels like 5 minutes, only to realize an hour has passed. Or you may sit down to think and feel, as if the day is dragging endlessly. The unpredictability itself creates a subtle disorientation. It's why some people describe loneliness as timeless, almost like drifting in an ocean without currents. But here's the paradox. This very distortion of time can become a gateway to altered states of consciousness. Mystics, hermits, and monks have historically embraced solitude precisely because it breaks ordinary temporal patterns. When you're not bound to schedules or conversations, you begin to perceive existence outside of clock time. A second can feel eternal. A day can feel weightless. This opens mental space for deeper reflection, even creativity. Writers, for example, often report that their most productive sessions come during lonely hours when the clock seems to vanish. Yet, there's a darker edge. When time loses stability, anxiety can creep in. People may feel trapped in endless moments, convinced that loneliness stretches forever. This can amplify depressive thoughts, because the brain links duration with meaning. If loneliness feels endless, it can convince you it is endless. And so, the perception of time intensifies the emotional weight. This is where we see the dual nature of solitude once again. Without repeating earlier points, but adding a fresh dimension. Loneliness bends time. Sometimes it's liberating, sometimes it's suffocating. The difference often lies in whether you frame those timeless moments as opportunity or as emptiness. Now, as we drift from the dimension of time, let's move into an even stranger terrain: how loneliness shapes the imagination itself. Because when silence stretches and the hours blur, the mind doesn't just wait passively, it begins to create. The creative and hallucinatory mind in solitude. When you are truly alone, beyond the ordinary distractions of life, your mind begins to behave in ways that it never does in company. The silence acts not as emptiness, but as a magnifier, stretching every thought, every sensation, every memory. In solitude, the boundaries between reality and imagination loosen. You begin to notice patterns where none existed before, connections between events that previously seemed unrelated, and insights that emerge unbidden, often startlingly clear. Many people have experienced this. When alone for hours, sometimes days, the mind begins to create vivid internal landscapes. These are not dreams exactly. They occur while awake, but they share the immersive quality of dreaming. You might imagine entire cities, conversations, or scenarios, and for fleeting moments, they feel as real as the objects around you. In these hallucinatory states, creativity thrives. Painters, writers, composers, and inventors throughout history have reported that solitude provided the most fertile ground for imagination. Without social cues, your inner narrative takes the lead. You start to invent, to reimagine, to reconstruct the world entirely in your mind. It's important to note that these experiences are not simply random. They exercise your brain in unique ways. When deprived of external stimulation, the brain fills the void with internally generated content. Neural circuits designed for pattern recognition and anticipation remain active, seeking stimuli, and in the absence of external input, they create their own. For some, these hallucinations are subtle, shapes shifting in the corner of the eye, sounds seeming to whisper. But for others, they become immersive, elaborate mental stories. Your brain effectively becomes both stage and actor, crafting a private theater of imagination. This state is double-edged. The same mental agility that produces beautiful ideas can also amplify worries. Minor anxieties grow in intensity, fears can seem larger, and past regrets may appear to play out in hyper-real detail. The mind's imagination in solitude is a mirror, reflecting both your potential and your vulnerabilities. Yet this tension is not purely negative. Writers often describe how moments of anxiety and isolation force them to confront and refine ideas they would have ignored in ordinary social contexts. Pain, fear, and wonder intermingle, fueling the creative engine. Loneliness becomes a laboratory where the mind experiments with both inspiration and apprehension. As hours pass, your imagination begins to organize itself into narratives. You reconstruct past experiences, sometimes rewriting outcomes or imagining new interactions. You create dialogues with absent friends, simulate responses from authority figures, and even stage confrontations that never happened. These mental rehearsals are exercises in both problem-solving and emotional processing. Interestingly, your brain doesn't require the presence of reality to learn from these narratives. Each imagined conversation teaches social cues, empathy, and strategy, making solitude a surprisingly effective arena for mental growth. What's remarkable is the sense of liberation solitude provides. No social rule constrain your creativity. You can invent entire societies, experiment with philosophies, or explore fantastical possibilities without judgment. Every rule of ordinary life, the expectations of colleagues, friends, or family, falls away, leaving your mind free to explore. This is why many great ideas, artworks, and philosophical insights have emerged from solitary minds. The absence of others doesn't only allow reflection, it sparks invention. The mind, in response to silence and absence, generates entire universes to inhabit, to explore, and to refine. And yet, as exhilarating as these experiences are, there is a natural transition waiting at the horizon. The hallucinatory mind eventually tires as hours stretch, as the neural circuits reach their limits, and as the weight of solitude reminds you of your physical body, your heartbeat, your breath. Here, the mind begins to slow, and a more reflective state emerges, a moment to integrate the visions, the insights, the imagined worlds. This is where our exploration of time, perception, and imagination in solitude converges, preparing us for the next step. How these inner journeys reshape your understanding of your relationships, your desires, and the way you connect with others when the world returns. Recalibrating relationships through solitude. Solitude does more than sharpen creativity or reshape perception. It alters the way you view the people around you. When you spend extended time alone, you begin to realize which connections in your life hold true meaning and which exist only out of habit, convenience, or fear of being by yourself. Silence becomes a filter. It strips away the noise of daily obligations and exposes the core of your relational world. In those long hours, you may notice how certain friendships drain your energy rather than nourish it. You might recall moments where you laughed with someone but felt emptier afterward, or times when you tolerated company simply to avoid facing your own thoughts. Alone, those dynamics become unmistakably clear. What once seemed like companionship can appear more like dependency. There is also a psychological effect that emerges in solitude: contrast. Being without others for long stretches makes their presence far more vivid when you return. Suddenly, small gestures, a smile, a thoughtful comment, a hand on your shoulder, take on magnified significance. Relationships that once felt ordinary acquire new depth because you have been reminded of what it feels like to exist without them. This heightened sensitivity can be both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, gratitude grows. You may cherish loved ones with renewed appreciation. On the other, you may feel frustrated with shallow exchanges, finding them unbearably hollow compared to the richness of your inner reflections. Isolation is a ruthless teacher. It often forces you to confront which ties are authentic and which are superficial. When alone, you notice whose voices still echo in your head with warmth, whose absence feels like silence, and whose memory brings more tension than comfort. Many discover that solitude empowers them to step away from toxic relationships. The dependency on constant noise, constant validation, suddenly appears in sharp contrast to the peace of quiet self-sufficiency. Solitude can reveal that what once felt like love was in fact control, or that what once felt like loyalty was more a habit than genuine care. The mind in solitude doesn't only strip away the unnecessary, it resets the entire emotional framework. Emotional highs and lows flatten into calm reflection. This state provides the clarity to assess relationships without being clouded by immediate emotional reactions. In the absence of others, you can ask, do I miss this person because I truly value them, or because I fear emptiness without them? That single question can alter the entire trajectory of your relational life. It separates love from attachment, connection from convenience, and intimacy from dependence. When the period of solitude ends, you return to society transformed. Your interactions are no longer automatic. You may find yourself speaking less, but saying more. You might avoid gossip or small talk, not out of disdain, but because you've grown used to the substance of your own reflections and crave conversations that match that depth. At the same time, the people who matter most to you often become radiant in their importance. Their voices cut through the silence you've endured. Their presence feels grounding, and your appreciation for them takes on a quiet intensity that never existed before. But relationships are only one dimension of what solitude reshapes. Beyond the social, there is something deeper, a shift in the sense of self. Because when you spend enough time without others, you encounter the rawest version of yourself. Your desires, your flaws, your resilience, and your fragility. And it is here, in this confrontation, that the true weight of being alone reveals itself. The self in isolation. Confronting identity. Without witnesses, when other people are around, identity is never truly your own. Every smile, every gesture, every choice is subtly shaped by the presence of witnesses. You perform a version of yourself, sometimes deliberately, sometimes unconsciously, for the benefit of those who see you. But in isolation, this performance dissolves. Without an audience, who are you really? This question can feel terrifying because so much of what we call self is entangled with how others perceive us. Solitude tears away the layers of performance. Without the mirror of another person's eyes, the reflection vanishes, and you are left with something raw, unedited, and unfiltered. The collapse of external validation. Most people don't realize how dependent they are on validation until it disappears. In isolation, no one compliments your appearance. No one affirms your ideas. No one laughs at your jokes. The stream of micro-confirmations that shapes daily existence runs dry. What remains is the naked truth. Do you still value yourself without applause? Some find liberation here, a sense of independence from external opinion. Others spiral into doubt, questioning their worth when stripped of recognition. Psychologists call this the difference between intrinsic and extrinsic identity. Extrinsic identity relies on others to define it. Intrinsic identity endures even when unseen. Solitude reveals which one dominates your inner life. Meeting the forgotten self. Isolation also confronts you with the parts of yourself that daily life suppresses. The quiet self, the creative self, the anxious self, the dreaming self. All of these emerge when there is no performance to maintain. These are often the most authentic aspects of who you are, but they are usually buried beneath the noise of social living. You might rediscover passions abandoned long ago, like writing, sketching, or simply daydreaming. Or you might face emotions you have carefully avoided, grief that was never processed, fear that was numbed by distraction, anger that was drowned in noise. Alone, there is no choice but to face them. The paradox of invisible identity. Here lies the paradox. In solitude, you may feel that your identity dissolves, since no one is there to recognize it. And yet, at the same time, you may experience the most profound sense of self, because it is no longer mediated by others. You are both diminished and expanded. You vanish from the social world, but emerge within your inner world. This duality explains why solitude can be both terrifying and transformative. For some, it feels like fading into nothing. For others, it feels like uncovering everything. Freedom without witness. One of the most startling realizations of deep solitude is the freedom of invisibility. Without witnesses, your choices no longer need justification. You can think strange thoughts, imagine impossible futures, rehearse versions of yourself without consequence. No one is recording. No one is judging. You are both the creator and the observer of your own inner theater. This freedom often brings clarity about what you truly want, apart from expectation. When no one is there to applaud or criticize, desires that are authentically yours rise to the surface. Solitude becomes a laboratory of identity, where the self can be experimented with, dismantled, and rebuilt. Transition forward. Yet identity is not the only dimension solitude reshapes. Beyond who you are without others lies another question: how solitude alters your perception of time itself. Because in isolation, hours stretch, days blur, and time loses the steady rhythm it keeps in the presence of people. It is here, in the distortion of time, that solitude reveals another layer of its psychological power. The distortion of time in solitude. When hours stretch and seconds collapse, time is usually measured by events: a conversation, a meeting, a shared meal, the laughter of a friend, the ringing of a phone. Each interaction creates a marker, a signpost in the endless stream of minutes. But in solitude, those markers vanish. Days are no longer broken into stories, and the mind confronts time in its raw, unstructured form. Elasticity of minutes. One of the strangest features of solitude is how elastic time feels. A single hour can stretch endlessly, every tick of the clock heavy and deliberate, as if the world has slowed to an unnatural rhythm. And yet, at other times, hours dissolve without notice. You look at the clock and find that the day has slipped past you like water through open hands. Psychologists have observed that without external cues, faces, voices, activities, the brain loses its anchor for measuring duration. What results is not the steady ticking of chronological time, but something fluid, irregular, deeply subjective. Time itself becomes an inner landscape, shifting with mood and attention. The weight of unoccupied time. When surrounded by people, time fills itself. Conversations absorb minutes, shared tasks occupy hours. Alone, the absence of activity can make time feel heavier, almost oppressive. The empty space stretches, and with it, a sense of exposure. You must now decide how to fill it. This is why some fear solitude, because it makes time feel unbearable. The silence demands that you sit with your own thoughts, and many discover how restless those thoughts truly are. Instead of passing quietly, time feels thick, dense, and uncomfortable. The flow of deep absorption. Yet solitude also unlocks the opposite experience, time that disappears entirely. In the absence of interruption, it is easier to enter what psychologists call flow, the state of deep absorption in a task where minutes vanish unnoticed. Reading, writing, painting, or even simply wandering through your own imagination. These can erase time in the most peaceful way. Here, solitude feels like timelessness. Instead of waiting for the clock to move, you step outside of it. The rhythm of your inner world replaces the rhythm of the external one. Time and memory in solitude. There is also a fascinating link between solitude, memory, and the perception of time. Days filled with social encounters generate many vivid memories, which make time appear full in retrospect. But when days are quiet and solitary, memory produces fewer markers. Looking back, those days can feel shorter, almost empty, even if they felt long while living them. This creates a paradox. Solitude stretches time while it is happening, but compresses time when remembered. Weeks of quiet can vanish from memory like mist, while even a single crowded day leaves an imprint that seems longer. The timeless mindset. For some, solitude becomes a doorway into timelessness itself. By detaching from the external world, you detach from the structures that bind you: appointments, deadlines, clocks. Time becomes irrelevant. You exist in a state that feels closer to eternity than to chronology, an infinite present moment. Spiritual traditions across cultures have spoken of this timeless solitude as a state of awakening. In the absence of external demands, the mind shifts toward awareness rather than measurement. Instead of counting hours, you experience them as waves, rolling endlessly without beginning or end. Transition forward. And yet, as powerful as time distortion is, solitude changes more than just hours and days. It reshapes your relationship to space itself. The rooms around you feel different when empty. Silence transforms environments, and even familiar places begin to breathe with a strange new presence when you are truly alone. The transformation of space in solitude. When rooms begin to speak. Most people think of space as something fixed: walls, furniture, doors, and windows. But solitude reveals that space is never neutral. The presence or absence of people transforms it. And in isolation, the familiar can feel altered, as though the environment itself begins to take on a hidden voice. A room filled with people absorbs energy. The sound of conversation, the subtle shifts of bodies, the constant exchange of glances. All of these things make a space feel alive, warm, dynamic. But remove everyone, and suddenly that same room becomes an amplifier. Small noises, your footsteps, the creak of a chair, the hum of electricity, take on new intensity. In solitude, the environment no longer hides in the background. It moves into the foreground. The emptiness of space magnifies perception, forcing awareness onto details that are usually invisible. One of the strangest effects of solitude is how it distorts familiarity. A room you know well, your bedroom, your kitchen, your living room, can suddenly feel uncanny when experienced alone for long stretches of time. The walls seem taller, the shadows deeper, the silence heavier. This is not because the room has changed, but because the mind projects new qualities onto it. Without other people anchoring reality, imagination creeps in, filling the silence with subtle unease or unexpected comfort. In this way, solitude reveals that our experience of space is always psychological, never purely physical. Silence itself becomes a kind of occupant in solitude. It fills the room like a presence, pressing in on you from the corners, wrapping itself around every object. Many people describe silence as almost alive in such moments, heavy, watchful, even protective. It is in these silences that some people feel a deep peace, as though the world has finally slowed down enough to let them breathe. Others, however, experience silence as unsettling, as if the absence of sound exposes something hidden. Both responses are equally real, shaped not by the room itself, but by the state of mind that solitude awakens. The memoryscape of solitude: echoes, shadows, and reconstructions. When silence wraps itself around us, memory awakens. Solitude is not just an empty space. It is a stage upon which the mind begins to project its own archive of images, sounds, and sensations. Without external stimuli, the inner cinema starts to play, sometimes with gentle familiarity, sometimes with haunting insistence. The unexpected return of the past. Often in solitude, memories appear uninvited. A scent, a fragment of a song, Even the silence itself can pull forth faces we thought we had forgotten. The past does not vanish. It lingers, hidden beneath the noise of daily life, waiting for stillness to bring it forward. These returns can be startling. A childhood moment resurfaces, not because it was significant, but because the mind, with no distractions, now has the space to wander back to it. Solitude opens doors we did not know were still locked inside us. Conclusion: the quiet gift of aloneness. And so we arrive here, at the edge of our long journey. We have wandered together through the landscapes of solitude, its shadows, its revelations, its whispers of memory, and its untapped power. But before this path closes, let us pause and reflect on what has unfolded, and perhaps what still lingers in you as you listen now. The paradox of solitude. Being alone is never simply one thing. It is not merely joy or sorrow, not only emptiness or fullness. It is paradox, an ache that can wound and a silence that can heal. To be alone is to stand at the threshold of two possibilities: despair or discovery. Which path unfolds often depends less on the circumstance and more on how we choose to meet it. You may recognize moments when solitude has felt like punishment, when the absence of others amplified a sense of isolation. But perhaps you can also recall moments when solitude felt expansive, even liberating. The quiet walk where your thoughts fell into place. The evening where stillness became a companion rather than a void. Aloneness as mirror. What solitude shows us is ourselves, reflected back with no filters. It is here we encounter the parts of us that remain hidden in the noise of society. Alone, there is no mask to wear, no audience to perform for. It is a raw space, sometimes intimidating, sometimes clarifying. And in that mirror, we realize something humbling. To be alone is to see that we are never fully abandoned, for the presence that remains is our own. The power to choose loneliness often convinces us that solitude is forced upon us. But solitude, when embraced consciously, becomes a choice, an act of agency. By reframing aloneness as an opportunity rather than a sentence, we reclaim its power. When you step into solitude willingly, it transforms. It ceases to be an absence of others and becomes a presence of self. In that shift, you discover freedom. Freedom from comparison, freedom from expectation, freedom to listen deeply to the currents moving inside you. The gentle invitation. So perhaps the question is no longer, why am I alone? But rather, what can I find here in this aloneness? What lessons, what clarity, what unspoken truths are waiting in the quiet? As you drift now into rest, let solitude be a companion, not an adversary. Let the silence cradle you instead of confronting you. Let the shadows of memory soften into gentle shapes, not heavy burdens. You here now, and to you listening. Know that even as you explore the depth of being alone, you are not truly alone in this moment. Your attention, your willingness to listen, creates a thread between you and me, a quiet connection across distance and time. You may be lying in the stillness of your room, yet this voice reaches you, and in that, there is presence. Take comfort in this. Solitude is not isolation. It is space. Space where you can breathe, reflect, and grow. Space where you can rediscover not only the world, but yourself. A closing whisper. So rest now. Let the thoughts of the day unravel. Allow the tension in your body to dissolve into the calm. And as you surrender to sleep, remember this truth. Being alone is not emptiness. It is possibility. It is the quiet canvas upon which you may paint new beginnings, new understandings, new ways of being. And when you wake again, may you carry with you a softer relationship to solitude, not as a shadow to fear, but as a gift to hold. Good night, listener. The journey is yours now.